looking for the captions to pop up. I'm just going to do the access statement for this room. So my name is Dr. Nick Winges-Llanes. I lead the Critical Disability Studies program here at UT, part of the Texas Center for Disability Studies and the School of Social Work, Steve Hitt's School of Social Work. So we have an access statement for the room.
I have the access statements here that I gave to the captioners and interpreters so that it would be uniform amongst us. Is it okay if I read them out?
A lovely person, yes, go for it.
Also, I think that, are you able to, for Zoom, for the captions on the screen, can you click the CC button on the bottom toolbar? Do you see that?
Yep.
And then can you turn on the captions? Are you able to do that? Okay, are they showing up there now?
Yes.
Okay, lovely. So hello everyone. I will let Dr. Nick talk very soon, don't worry. But before we start, I wanted to read some of the access statements. So we have an access statement for this room. As you can hopefully see, ASL and CART captioning is provided throughout this event. For those joining us in person, there are accessible restrooms on all floors of this building, gender inclusive restrooms on the 4th floor in 4.218, and a quiet room on the 4th floor in 4.200. So please feel free to move about or inhabit the space as feels comfortable, such as choosing to stand, sit, lay down, or move as you need for your body to feel as comfortable as possible in the space. We ask that you stay mindful of COVID-19 safety practices to the best of your ability. And then if you're joining us on Zoom, CART captions are provided. You should have the option to access the captions both by clicking the CC. Oh, sorry, I lagged. Did y'all catch what I said? Okay. So you should be able to access captions both by clicking the CC button on the bottom toolbar and turning on captions directly through Zoom, or you can access captions through a separate website that will be dropped in the Zoom chat by our lovely friend, Andrew Dell'Antonio. ASL interpreters should be spotlighted. If you have any questions, concerns, or problems with accessibility or technology during the course of this webinar, please feel free to message me in the Zoom or to email me at jazzyjbell@utexas.edu. And I will also drop that in the chat so that you don't have to remember it. And just in case you get kicked out, I might save it so that if you have trouble getting back on, I can make sure you get back on. And then before we start, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement really quick. This land acknowledgement was written by the Native American and Indigenous Collective, an agency of the Multicultural Engagement Center at UT Austin. We recognize the Comanches, Apaches, Hualiotecos, the Caddo peoples, the Carrizo peoples, the Bidai, the Kiowa, the Wichita, the Tonkawa, and all other indigenous peoples and their descendants as the original inhabitants of this land. We acknowledge that the state and federal government has displaced and continues to displace indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the historical traumas of colonialism. And we aim to honor and respect indigenous peoples, their sovereignty, cultures, customs, and beliefs. And then before we welcome Dr. Nick, we do want to give a really special shout out to the following departments for making Cal's visit possible. We want to shout out the Department of Philosophy, Cal's alma mater, I believe, the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Fine Arts, LGBTQ Studies, the Gender and Sexuality Center, and the Texas Center for Disability Studies. So thank you all so much for being here, and welcome, Dr. Nick.
yeah, this isn't really about me. I was just here to like help out. So during the presentation, I'll be able to go around and give you all the mic if you have questions during the presentation. And I'll let Cal know if we need to slow down for whatever, for any interpretation. But other than that, I will be quiet and preferably off screen. So I will be in the background, and I am going to turn it over to Cal.
Hi, so my name is Cal Montgomery. Just in case anybody wants to know what I look like, I'm a sort of stubble-headed Santa Claus-shaped figure in a wheelchair. You will notice that there are not any descriptions of slides. That's because I didn't make any slides. So that's not me leaving people out, just more leaving everybody out together. I'm not very good at slides. We're just going to acknowledge that up front. So earlier today, I went over the university co-op, as one does. And while I was there, I overheard a fascinating conversation in which some people were looking for the cow. And I was not really sure what to make of that, because first off, I had not heard that Vivo had come out as trans. But on the other hand, as I looked around, I also didn't think that Vivo would probably be in the co-op because the aisles looked far too narrow for his horns or her horns. Their horns, I don't know. And it just struck me again how easy it is to feel like you don't really know what's going on. Or sometimes as if perhaps somebody else may not know what's going on. Because most people do not keep cows in stores. In my experience, if any of you are currently keeping a herd of cows in the store, I do apologize. But I've spent my whole life pretty much feeling stupid on and off. And sometimes, to be fair, feeling like other people are stupid. My last day of high school English, my teacher, as we left the room, said to me, she was a charming woman. She said, I hope you will do very well at your next school, where they apparently won't care if you're lazy and stupid. We did not get to evaluate our teachers in that school, which was probably a good thing because I would have probably been a little bit too explicit. But that's pretty much how I felt at that school. They, on the one hand, had spent 6 years telling me I was stupid. And on the other hand, had spent 6 years fully expecting that I was going to go to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. I did not want to go to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. I knew a lot of people who were going to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And I didn't mostly like them very much. And look, if they were all going to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, maybe other people would go to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton that I also wouldn't like. My home is in Texas, but my family had moved around since I was a very small child. So even though I had legal residence first in Dallas and later in Grand Prairie, I never actually lived here. We visited every 2 years. But I really wanted to get to know my aunts and my cousins, and also my uncles, but in fairness, more my aunts. My grandmother and grandfather had by that point died, so it was aunts, uncles, and cousins, but I wanted to get to know them. And I also figured that even though I am pretty much Simone Biles level talented at pissing people off, I could probably not alienate 50,000 people in 4 years. And I had looked it up, and the University of Texas was at the time the largest university, the least likely place for me to piss off every single person on campus before I graduated. So it seemed like the perfect school for me. And the school I went to was an East Coast snobbish school, and they were not big on state universities, except for very few, like Penn or UCLA, and they were not big on Texas. So after I failed to get into Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, which, in fairness, that was possibly partly my doing, or partly they just could figure out what kind of a student I was. And the only school I got into was this one. We had a little meeting with Principal Clint Wilkins and my parents about how the school would probably never survive the scandal if it ever became known that one of their graduates had come here. Since I wasn't very fond of the school, I didn't much care if it came apart over my going to Texas. So this was not the big wake-up call that everybody had expected it to be. And the school seems to be doing just fine. It still exists. They have surprisingly never invited me to a single reunion, which is probably a good idea, given the sort of things I would do if I went there. But that's pretty much how I grew up. You know, on the one hand, I was supposed to be really, really smart. On the other hand, I was supposed to be really, really stupid. And there's a lot of emotional tension in that. You know, you feel it's threatening to feel stupid. It's threatening to feel like other people perceive you as stupid. It's threatening to be forced into functioning like you're stupid because you don't have the tools that you need. And sometimes it's far worse than that. Sometimes it's dangerous. When I was about 9, I was attending a new school in a new country. And one day, some armed men ran into my classroom and said something, and I had no idea what they said because I don't process speech that well. And everybody else jumped up and ran out of the building. So I jumped up and I ran out of the building, and everybody scattered. And I looked around and I'm alone in the street. And I realized they had told us to go home. And here's the thing. I lived in the building when school was. So I turned back around and the doors were locked. And that was one of those moments when I felt incredibly stupid because clearly everyone else had understood what was going on and I had not. It turned out there were rumors that somebody was coming to attack the compound. They never showed up. So it was not nearly as dramatic as it sounds, but it was kind of frightening for me at that moment when I realized that people might be coming to kill me and I might be stuck alone in the street. It was also scary when I got back up to my apartment and discovered that my job was to make sure that my sister and brother didn't get killed. But that it wasn't a high priority if I didn't get killed. Because, you know, I was the stupid one. And my family, I think, made my sister and brother feel like I was the smart one and they were the stupid ones. But they sure as hell made me feel like they were the smart ones and I was the stupid one. And I don't even understand the point of this, but that's how we grew up. And we're not close now. Eventually I got to the University of Texas, which is where I wanted to be. And in my first semester, I discovered that I was really not cut out to be an economist. And I was really not cut out to be an astronomer. And I had no interest in mastering calculus. As far as I'm concerned, what happens under this curve can stay under the curve, because I don't care. And sociology would have actually been a really good fit, but I didn't understand how much of it I'd already read, so it seemed very boring to me. But I was taking a class from this guy named Rick Roderick over in philosophy, and he was just amazing. He was an astounding teacher. He has since died. But he was an astounding teacher, and I knew this is what I wanted to do. And then a year later, I found myself in another philosophy class with a professor named Nicholas Asher. It was philosophy of language. And this guy just made it look so fascinating. And I had no idea what was going on. None. Now, I am good at a number of things. They're weird things, they're different things that other people are good at sometimes. If I know what words go together, I can string sentences together so they sound like I know what I'm talking about. I usually do not know what I'm talking about. But I can sound like I know what I'm talking about. So eventually I worked up the nerve to go to this poor man's office. And I said, you know, sir, your class looks fascinating, but I don't understand a word of it. And he said, well, you're getting A's. And I said, yeah, I'm getting A's because I know what words go in what sentences with what other words, but I don't understand any of the sentences I'm writing. And he sort of looked at me the way people look at you when you say something like that. And then he gave me a gift that I had never been given before by a teacher. He said, well, what do you need? Nobody had ever asked me that before. I had spent, by that point, 13, 14 years sitting in classrooms, not having a clue what was happening. And then going home with a pile of textbooks and reading them and then coming back and trying to pass the test based on what I read in the books. It did not really occur to me that school was for learning stuff. It's just basically where you sat quietly and calmly and entertained yourself inside of your own head. So Nicholas said to me, "What do you need?" So I told him, I said, "I need a reading list." "You need a good reading list. I'll go study it. There's a decent chance I can figure it out for myself, but I need to know what to read." And he pulled out a legal pad and he started writing down this list of articles. And I turned out to be right. I absolutely loved the stuff that he was teaching, but it took me doing this to get access to it. And all of a sudden, I wasn't stupid anymore. In fact, I was quite bright. It turned out that there was a bunch of stuff in philosophy, and specifically in analytic philosophy, so y'all can laugh if you want, I understand that, that I was really good at. I'm really good at formal logic, or I was really good at formal logic, I don't really keep up. I was good at model theory. And these are things that not everybody is good at. So it wasn't just that I was bad at things that not everybody was bad at, I was good at things that not everybody was good at. And that started me thinking about a whole lot of things. Because all of a sudden it occurred to me that it wasn't that some people were smarter than me and some people were less smart than me. It was a lot more complicated than that. Because my life never goes in a straight path, the immediate institution that I attended after the University of Texas was Austin State Hospital up the street. I was in unit acute 2C for a large part of that summer. And I met a number of people in Austin State Hospital who really did not fit the world's expectations for who's smart. I knew this one guy, and he told me his life story. He said, "I have many mothers. I have a native mother in native lands, but I have many mothers, and some are good and some are evil." And I wasn't really sure what to do with that. And this was before we had some of the privacy protections we have now, and the privacy protections we have now are kind of a joke anyway. So naturally, the staff told me what they thought of this. And they said, "Well, he's psychotic. He doesn't know what he's saying. You know, just ignore him. It doesn't make any sense." They said the true story is his mother was deported shortly after she gave birth to him in the United States. And he grew up in foster care. And he actually was in more foster homes than most foster kids. And most foster kids who grew up their whole life in foster care spend a lot of time in a lot of different homes. They said in some of those places, he was nurtured pretty well, but in others, he was really abused. I said, "You just told me the same story you told me." He has a native mother who's been deported to her native land. He has had many mothers. Some are good and some are evil. You told me the same story in different words. How can he be psychotic? And you're right. It's the same story. And to their credit, of the facilities I have not voluntarily spent time in, that Austin State was by far the best. You know, the people I was talking to listened to me about that. There was a social worker there. He taught a class. We had a day program. I remember only 2 classes in the day program. There was one on Texas womanhood, which I did not want to be assigned to because I'm trans male, but nobody recognized that, so I was assigned to this. I lasted 1 day. It turns out that people who are trading fingernail painting would prefer not to trade it with somebody whose motor skills are so poor that they paint their nails all the way up to the second knuckle. So after 1 day, I was excused from Texas ladyhood class, which is probably a good thing because I was never going to succeed in that class. But the other one was this guy taught by a guy named Floyd. And what he did, I don't know what they called it, but I called it DSM etiquette. He went through the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the time, which was, I believe, the DSM-3R, it might have been still 3. And he hit all the diagnoses that you were likely to run into in the state hospital. And he told you about them. But he didn't tell you about them the way they told me about them in my psychology classes on campus. The only one I really remember is the one for paranoid schizophrenia. And you know, the classic explanation for paranoid schizophrenia is, well, you know, people believe things that aren't true. They may see or hear things that aren't really there. You know, it's all about how people do not perceive reality correctly. That's the center story. And he said paranoid schizophrenia is basically the experience of being told that you're wrong about your core beliefs all the time. He says everybody will tell you that you're wrong. You know things, you're certain of things. You're as certain of things as anybody in this room is of anything. And people will tell you you're wrong. He said, let me be blunt. The staff here are going to tell these people that they're wrong. So if you know about somebody that they have paranoid schizophrenia, maybe don't talk about that. I mean, if you get asked, sure, answer the question, but you could also talk about something else. You do not have to talk about, are there people down the hallway trying to attack us? You can talk about football. And that core of etiquette of trying to understand where the other person's coming from, even when they are coming from a place that is very different from where I'm coming from, has really stood me in good stead ever since. You know, I learned a lot in this place from Floyd and mostly from my other colleagues. But again, the state hospital was a place where I realized I wasn't that stupid. Very early on, I was sitting in the non-smoking section of the unit because this was a while back, and not only was there a smoking in a non-smoking section of the one room we were allowed in, but they gave us cigarettes. In fact, that was pretty much the only thing they would give you if you behaved yourself, was cigarettes. So I sit in the non-smoking section and I noticed that all the people are just slowly picking themselves up from the non-smoking section and wandering over to the smoking section. And I thought to myself, something is going to happen. I don't know what, but it does not look like I want to be here when it does. So I picked myself up and I wandered over to the smoking section. We all crowded ourselves in. And a couple minutes later, the psychiatrist came out from behind the plexiglass that used to hide behind, which I guess about a week before I got there, somebody got through the plexiglass. So they were very nervous about it. They had thought it was bulletproof, but it was apparently not bulletproof enough. Which is one of my favorite things about the plexiglass, to be honest, because these people annoyed me. But so he came out from behind the plexiglass and he went over to the one person who's still in the smoking section. And I don't know what he said to her. It was probably friendly because he was a nice enough man. And she threw a table at him. And I thought, well, I am not the stupidest person in this room. And the reality is, it's not that I was smarter than him, and it's not that he was smarter than me. It's that we knew different things. I knew, for instance, that when that you can read how somebody's going to react sometimes by reading how the people that know how they're going to react are reacting to them. And he apparently did not know that. He knew a lot of other things. He knew some things about alternative medicine that I did not know. He knew a lot about, actually, I'm not even sure anymore what, but he definitely knew a great many things that I did not know. But there were clearly some things that I knew about that he did not know about. And slowly, my whole approach began to change. So eventually, I was supposed to be in there for the rest of my life, but one day, the place I was in burned down, and I do have an alibi for the record. I did not start that fire. And the first few of us to get places to stay got out. And I was highly motivated to get out because I did not want to be there. So I got out, and I was out accidentally. And this has meant that I have survived for decades now without the services that I need to function, but also without being trapped. It's a very awkward situation, but that is where I have been. So obviously I need to get a job. Well, it turned out that my history was too spotty for me to be trusted with the merchandise that we sold in stores at minimum wage retail. So I got a job working in a group home. It's apparently giving me control over 7 people was not nearly as scary as giving me control over a mass market paper product, which is something that we really value in our society. So I should not have been hired there, but I did my best. And once again, I'm meeting people that society has always told me are not very bright. And they certainly don't meet the stereotypes for being very smart people. And they all were. You know, some of them did not speak at all. Some of them spoke, some of them spoke, but it wasn't really clear what they meant. But if you got to know these people, they all had perspectives, and they all had ideas, and they all had attitudes, and they all had things that were important to them. But you know, most of us never got to know them. I remember there's one point I was working in the house with a woman, and I'm supposed to be the functional one in charge of her. She had grown up in Fernald State School, which is a developmental center in Massachusetts. And in Fernald, like in many of those places, they housed people in cottages, which were basically these big buildings with big old dorms. And she used to run her cottage at night. Just like at the state hospital, the staff at these places tended to stay behind the plexiglass. And so if somebody wet the bed, or if somebody had a nightmare, or somebody had a medical emergency in the middle of the night, this was the person who took care of them. I was not that functional. And I knew I was not that functional. And I had a better education. I had a higher IQ because I was tested when I was inside. I'll tell you something, getting an intellectual disability diagnosis after you have your bachelor's degree is a whole different experience than getting it before you start kindergarten. And I knew this, and she knew this. We both knew this. We both knew we were in a structure where I was regarded as intelligent, she was regarded as not. And therefore I got paid to be there and she did not. And therefore I had certain power that I could exert over her if I chose to, and she did not. And I tried to be a responsible person in the situation. But everybody in this place was also dealing with the issues around being thought to be stupid. There was one woman there, her family was Roman Catholic. So for Christmas, for Easter, for Mother's Day, we would pick her mother up from the nursing home and bring her over to the house and have lunch with her. And the two of them would tell this story every time. When this woman was born, her mother had been told, put her in an institution. Move on with your life, look after your other kids, just put her in the institution and forget her. And her mother did put her in the institution, but she didn't forget her. She continued to love her and she continued to go see her. But she basically bought into this idea that this was a person with no internal life whatsoever. And then eventually, we got around to the time when we were starting to get people out of the big institutions and put them in the small institutions, which is what group homes are. We have not got all the way to where people are free, but there weren't the big institutions, the small institutions. And they wanted to move this one. And her mother was like, no, she needs to be here. This is where she needs to be, you know. They told me when she was born, this is where she needs to be. And I've seen how she's been taken care of. And I think she gets good care here and she should stay here. And finally, they took the woman behind some one-way glass. They said, watch your daughter. And it wasn't even much as far as I can tell. It was the kind of work you do in sheltered workshops. And I don't know if you've ever worked in a sheltered workshop or if you ever visited a sheltered workshop, but it is very menial, repetitive work that is usually designed to be as hard as possible for people given what their motor skills are. You know, if you got somebody with CP, they're gonna have to put little tiny things in a little bitty bag. Then we say, see, you know, they can't even produce very fast. Well, very few people can produce very fast when they're being asked to do a task that is physically almost impossible for them. But they had her do this. And every time we would get to this part of the story, the woman who lived in the house would say, I'm smart, I can learn. And her mother would say, yeah, yes, that is the day I learned you could learn. And so she got out, she got a job in a sheltered workshop, which again, it's a sheltered workshop. It's not something I'm particularly thrilled with, but it was better than how she had grown up. She was living in a group home. It was there 4 or 5 people. And she had a much better situation, again, because she was regarded as more intelligent than she had previously been regarded. And we see a lot of people like this. One of my heroes is a fellow named Roland Johnson. Does anybody know that name, Roland Johnson? So he is died now, but Roland grew up in Penhurst Asylum, which is a notorious institution in Pennsylvania. It's closed now. He was a black man. And he has written with Carl Williams a memoir of his time in Penhurst called Lost in a Desert World. It's available online. It's also available in hard copy. And many people with intellectual disabilities who grew up in these facilities did not leave a written record because they were never taught to read. And if you don't get access to literacy, you're probably not going to produce a great deal of literature. Or in the written sense, you may produce oral literature, but you're not going to produce written literature. But Roland worked with this man, Carl Williams, to produce this. And he talks about all the same stuff that people from those facilities talked about. The way they split people into high grades and low grades. Now where I was in the psych system, I was not in the DD system. We had chronics and acutes. I was a chronic. At the time I went in, the acute chronic line was 60 days. I mean, it's 59 days before I became a chronic. Now it's like 4 days, 5 days. People move from acute to a chronic very fast. At the time that I went in, if you made it to chronic, there was a decent chance you were never getting out. They really, if they liked you, pushed to get you out in 59 days. Today, of course, almost nobody will pay for a stay that's 59 days long. But at the time, you know, if you didn't want to stay there for the rest of your life, you try to get out. And they had high grade wards and they had low grade wards. And the high grades, which was there, and it's an offensive term, and I'm using it on purpose because it is the term, were made to feel superior to the low grades. And so sometimes if Roland were to do something the staff did not like, he would be punished by getting shipped to a low grade ward for a while. But also as a way to save money, and this happened both in the psych and the DD systems, they had people provide care for one another. And so Roland got a job at one point. He did things like on Sundays, when the low grades families would come visit them, he would dress them. Because nobody bothered to put clothes on these people the other 6 days of the week. But they would get dressed if their families were going to see them. And this is where many of the self-advocacy movement's early leaders became leaders. They were pretty much forced into becoming leaders by a structure of an institution that was just trying to save money. It was just cheaper to have, and you know, sure, nobody thought Roland was capable of much, but then nobody thought the people Roland was looking after were worth much. So it all sort of made sense to people. So when he got out, he was introduced to self-advocacy, which is a movement of people initially with intellectual disabilities, increasingly intellectual and developmental disabilities, and now we use the same word over in the neurodiversity movement, which just confuses the hell out of everything. But who, having watched their parents and their family members take control of the narrative from the professionals who had previously been the experts, they said, we're speaking for ourselves. This is where person-first language came from. This is in the 1960s and 70s. It's people saying, we are people first. They did not get access to education, to families to grow up in, to housing, to jobs, often to food, to water. I have known many people who drank compulsively out of toilets when they got to group homes. And this isn't because they're defective people, it's because they have learned that if you get access to fluids, you get them into your body as fast as possible because you may not get them again. Or we're talking people who are denied everything because of their disabilities. And so they very clearly distinguish between themselves and their disabilities. It's like we're people first, and therefore we should be treated as people before we're treated as disabled. Because being treated as disabled meant not getting the most basics of basics. And just historically, if you look at American society, this was the white people, because if you weren't white, you weren't even considered good enough for that. Right? The early institutions were largely white, because nobody really wanted to take the burden of raising disabled children off of the families of color. Now it's the other way around. You get far more people of color in the facilities because the white families are more likely to get supports in the home. But even for the most privileged of people, it was still pretty bad. So Roland studied power. And it's a beautiful keynote he did online. And he sounds like the kind of person who was educated at Penhurst Asylum. He does not sound like the kind of person who was educated at Harvard, which makes sense because he was not educated at Harvard, he was educated at Penhurst. And he asks people, who's in charge? Who's in charge of your life? Are you in charge or is staff in charge? You should be in charge, right? You should be in charge of your life. Why aren't you in charge? You should be in charge. And this is, if you listen to it, it's a meditation on power. You almost never hear this even as far up as the independent living movement, which is the movement that arose out of people studying in nursing homes and people with physical disabilities. Because it doesn't trigger people's understanding of this is an intelligent person making a theoretical point about power. Now, if we want to start talking about, say, Bertrand Russell and power, big time Cambridge philosopher, right? We all understand how that works, but we almost never talk about Roland Johnson. And what Roland Johnson had to say about power matters. There are many other theorists with intellectual disabilities, and I use the word theorist on purpose because nobody thinks of it as theory, but it's an attempt to understand the world and how the world works and how you maneuver in the world to survive and to thrive and to get the things you need and to get the things that you want for your people. It's political theory. It just doesn't sound to most people like political theory. I remember I attended a meeting once at a Center for Independent Living. This is mostly people socialized with the independent living movement, coming up with the values derived from largely white people with mobility disabilities. And we had a group of self-advocates there. All or almost all were Black men. And they all had intellectual or developmental disabilities. At least one was autistic and had a PhD, but most did not have a formal education. And people ask the usual insulting questions, you know, how do you feel about self-advocacy? What's the best thing about being a self-advocate? And so, even though these people know me and they know what kind of thing I do, they don't like me in their building. They called on me, which was very unwise. And I said, if you could change one thing about the world to make things better for people with disabilities, what would you change? To me, that is a political question. That's a question about policy. It's a question about political theory, but it's also a question phrased in a way that is accessible to most of the people on this panel. I could have said, you know, suppose that we were to reopen the HCBS final settings rule and, you know, tinker with the details, what would you do? I don't think anybody would have answered that. But that's not because they don't have opinions. That's because I would not have phrased it in an accessible manner. And you may not know what the hell I just said either. I barely know what I said. But I do know you would say that in a policy conference. Although the answer is, oh, no, we cannot reopen the settings rule. If we reopen the settings rule, you know, we will have to go backwards. So it's just not the time for that. So I know the answer, just not a good answer. So I asked this question, and people went down the road, and most of the people talked about employment, which makes sense because in Illinois, we have been working on 14C employment. If you don't know what 14C employment is, there is a minimum wage in this country that every worker is guaranteed unless they fit into one of several classes. A lot of service workers don't get minimum wage because they're tipped employees, so they're supposed to get tips. And I said, you're supposed to, is if you go down to the average affordable restaurant and say, hey, does anybody ever not give you a tip? You will hear that they're not always getting tips. They're getting taxed on the tips. They're just not getting tips. Students don't always have to get paid minimum wage because they're being trained. Honestly, if your job is such that a student can do it, I think it's such that a student should get paid for it, but that's just me. If you are an asleep person, you may not have to get paid. One of my early jobs in group homes was working the sleep overnight shift. So I'd come in at 11 and then I would be allowed to be asleep until like 6 in the morning. So I would get paid less than minimum wage for that time. And then I would get up and I would help people with their ADLs in the morning breakfast, get them out the door. So that was a big surprise to me because I thought I was getting minimum wage and I was looking at my paycheck and I'm not. And then there's 14C, sub-minimum wage, which is for people with disabilities. And the basic idea is if you are so disabled that you are not the kind of person that anybody would ever pay regular wage to, certain organizations can give permission to pay you by piecework. So I flunked out of a shelter workshop, by the way. I was considered too low functioning to work in a shelter workshop. I was not considered too low functioning to be a minimum wage supervisor. I was just considered too low functioning to be a sub-minimum wage worker, which again is kind of how my life goes. It's weird. But what they do is they have some non-disabled people come in and they do a job and they do it for, you know, a few hours. So they're fresh and they're fast and they're not bored by it. They're getting knocked out. And then they have disabled people come in and they do the same job. And so they take the minimum wage, they divide it by the number of pieces that the non-disabled people were able to do in an hour, and they get paid piecework. When I got shifts in a shelter workshop, I was told, do not bother to pick up people's work and replace the tools. Right, people were like filling 3 sippy cups into a plastic sleeve, which was, I had a team one day that was supposed to do that. If they put all their sippy cups in the plastic sleeves, it doesn't matter if you get over there fast and give them new sippy cups and sleeves. So aside from the fact that many of these people did not have the physical fine motor skills to get sippy cups into plastic sleeves very effectively, if you don't give people empty sippy cups, they're not going to put them in plastic sleeves. I mean, that just seems obvious. But this was never considered to be my failing or the facility's failing. This was their failing. They're just not fast enough. I don't know how they were supposed to be fast enough to get sippy cups that they did not have and the sleeves they did not have because I did not give them to them. But somehow this was the expectation. And this is rule. So we're fighting against 14C in Illinois. And so when people talk about employment, they're talking about real jobs. And they're not talking about real jobs like I would like to go be a programmer at IBM. They're talking about real jobs like I don't want to work from 9 to 3. I want to work from 9 to 5 or 8 to 4. And I want to make minimum wage. And I want to do something that is in some way related to my interests. And where, you know, the company doesn't get to have mandatory downtime. Because that's another factor at children's workshops, is they don't always have enough work, so you just sort of hang out for 4, 5, 6 hours. And the expectation is you have to be there because the facility doesn't get paid if you're not there. But there's no work, so there's no pay. And I have known people who come home from work with 2 weeks paycheck in their pocket and it's $1.40. Okay, and granted, this wasn't recent. There's been some inflation since then, but $1.40 has not been a good 2 weeks paycheck in my entire life. I'm not that old. So we've been talking about that. We finally get to this last guy, and he has a different thing. I live on the south side of Chicago. South side of Chicago, we have certain issues that not everybody else in the United States has. And he says, my biggest concern is violence. He didn't say it in those words, but he said violence. You know, it's too violent. Too many people are getting hurt. And he talks about this for a minute, and then he says at the end, it gets on my nerves. And the whole room erupted in laughter. And I was so angry. Because you know what, if you went to Harvard, you're not going to say, injustice gets on my nerves. But if you grew up in some places, that is exactly how you're going to phrase it. I used to support a woman, and she used to say things were like a Christmas tree. You know, hey, you hungry? Like a Christmas tree. And people were like, oh, you know, she's so stupid, she didn't even know when Christmas is. Well, that's not the case. The case is she comes from a community where there's a great deal of poverty and a great deal of distress and a great deal of alcoholism. And so in fact, there are great many conversations about managing other people's alcoholism. And so the phrase lit up like a Christmas tree comes up an awful lot. If you want to talk about somebody who's really drunk, you're going to use the phrase like a Christmas tree in this neighborhood. Probably not at Harvard, but she wasn't at Harvard. I think it's not like people aren't saying the same things other people are saying. It's not like people aren't making some good points. And in some cases, it's not like they're not making points that other people aren't saying. There's a self-advocate out in Washington State, Ivan Smith, who has phrased institutionalization as, quote, administrative control over people's lives, unquote. And that is the clearest and the shortest explanation of how institutionalization works in the psych and DD systems that I've ever seen. You talk to people in wheelchairs, primarily white people in wheelchairs, you're going to hear that institutionalization is about congregation and it's about segregation. It's about how many people that are not related, that do not choose to live together in one building and blah, 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 blah. But that's because a lot of the control that happens in people's lives happens because they are congregated and segregated. You can take people with wheelchairs out into the community, give them individualized services, and they can have a fair amount of control over their own lives. But when we try to move people with psych labels and people with intellectual and developmental disabilities out of institutions, we reproduce the control in the community. Now, part of that is because we use group homes. And again, group homes have shared staff. You have shared staff, there's a limit to how much control can be provided because you have to negotiate with your housemates. You cannot say, I would like to go to this book club every Thursday night because there's one staff and there's 3 other people and you all got to go together or not at all. If you don't have your own supports, there's a limit to how much self-determination you can have in any area where you need those supports. Plus, most of us do not go to book clubs to hang out with our roommates, even if we have roommates. We go to book clubs to talk about books and meet new people and things like that. But if you're always having to go with your 3 roommates everywhere, or, you know, what it was me, it was much larger groups because my group homes were all 30-person facilities. You know, it's very hard for people to approach you. It's one thing to strike up a conversation with one stranger. It's another thing to strike up a conversation with 30 strangers. Most people are not going to do that. Sorry, blanking on what I was trying. So I think my point is, it's not that these are not intelligent people. It's that they express their intelligence in ways we don't expect. So let's come back and think about this room. Who did we plan for to be in this room? We planned for people who can either understand spoken English or written English, or, and I'm not sure what sign system we're using, possibly ASL, possibly SIMCOM. If you only speak Spanish, this was not accessible to you. If you were in Austin and you had access to the sign-up facility, then you could probably come to this. But if you're not in Austin and you don't have an internet connection, then this event was not accessible to you. If you're in Austin and you would really like to come and you heard about it, but you're anxious because you feel like you're the sort of person that the people at the university are going to look down on, and so you're afraid to come into this room, in a real sense, this event is not accessible to you. We plan for certain kinds of people. And then the people who have the natural capacities or the enculturated capacities to thrive in these environments are who we end up thinking of as smart. Right. My father was born in Dallas in 1934 to a working class family. He was a first-generation University of Texas student. He got through using the naval ROTC. He was the first person in his family to go to college. When he graduated high school, his sister Nancy gave him luggage. And I remember him telling me years later with tears in his eyes that like, that was the most loving gift he had ever had, because he wanted out of Dallas. He wanted to go to university. He wanted to move on. Now, I was born in 1967 in Washington, D.C., in a middle-class family. Both of my parents were college educated. My father had been to graduate school at that point. It's a completely different life. It's not that I'm smarter than my father was. It's also not certain that I'm less smart than you, but although I understand that you sometimes thought that. But I had a far easier time getting through than he did. I mean, for one thing, he was having to pay, and I got a lot of financial support from my parents. When I came here and they said, you're supposed to spend 15 hours a week in class and 30 hours a week outside of class studying, I said, 45 hours a week, I have 45 hours a week. If I had a full-time job and I had family responsibilities and I couldn't afford to live on campus, but I was living, 60 miles outside of town with an unreliable vehicle, I might not have had 45 hours a week to study. And so that's an advantage that I had right there, because I was the kind of person that they planned for. And so as we look around the room, we can see who's here, and we often don't see who's not here. Or if we do see who's not here, we think, well, they're not the kind of people who should be here. Or they're not the kind of people who want to be here. They didn't try hard enough to be here. That's pretty much never been my experience. I mean, there are certainly people anywhere you go who don't want to be there. But generally, if it's a place that certain kinds of people want to go, other kinds of people want to go too. but we usually don't see the kind of representation that we would expect. And we all grow up with this, and we all come to see it as normal. Like, if you ask people at Center for Independent Living, how many people with intellectual disabilities do you have on your professional staff? You gotta say professional, or they, well, yeah, our janitor, but that's not the same thing. How many people do you have on your professional staff? Like, they'll look at you like you're weird. Able Center out in South Carolina has one. She's also not your typical person with an intellectual disability because she has an advanced degree. All right. Technically, I fit into this category of, I don't have a job, but still, I'm too much diversity, which is possibly the scariest thing I've ever heard in my life. I mean, seriously, you look at me and it's white people in wheelchairs and I'm too much diversity. Where the hell are you? Because, I mean, if you said too much an asshole, I would buy that. I've met me. But too much diversity is not true. I'm usually okay with people excluding me as long as it's personal. But if it's demographic, then I'm like, well, that's not fair. And they hate me, so I'm never getting hired now. But realistically, no, this is concerning. You know, they can't even imagine this. And it's not that people can't do this stuff, right? It's that people are not being provided the supports. So let's come back to schools. We have all felt, I bet, I mean, I'm not gonna ask you to out yourself, but I bet we've all felt stupid in one classroom or another. And I remember every semester, the professor would get up front and say, there's no such thing as a stupid question. And you'd be like, you think there's such thing as a stupid question? And I can tell you this, I worked as a TA, they think there's such thing as a stupid question, because we'll go back afterwards to the department and talk about what the stupid questions were. We're just not supposed to let on to the students have figured this out. And some of these questions, you know, it's not that hard to understand why people think they're stupid. I think the one that used to drive me up the wall was, do I have to learn this? Or is it not going to be on the final? And I would say, well, if we didn't think it was important, we would teach it to you. But you know, think about it, that is not a stupid question. Because what I think you ought to learn and what you think you ought to learn are two different things. And there's no guarantee that I am right. My father was very concerned for my future because I refused to learn butter trimming. He wasn't sure how I would make it in the 1970s and 80s without a capacity to churn butter. Churning butter has never been my biggest barrier to success. I still have no idea how to do it, and I don't think I'm ever going to need it, to be honest. Now, I'm not saying it's not a useful thing for some people to know. I'm just saying it is not as critical a skill as one would believe. Currently, it's cursive. I learned cursive. It's very nice if you want your handwriting to look like circles. But and it's very useful if you want to study history and you want to be able to read stuff that people wrote 100 years ago. I'm not saying cursive has no uses. I'm just saying I think we could lose cursive and the downfall of civilization will not be imminent. Or if it is, it will be for some other reason. I remember when we were all upset because young people had phones, right? And they were typing in abbreviated ways, then type out the full words. And this was just going to be the end of everything, you know. We didn't know if we could go on. And I thought, didn't we used to do the same thing with the telegraph? We all survived the telegraph. I mean, not everybody, some people who were alive then are dead, but society has survived the telegraph. And we used to write very abbreviated letters because it cost per letter. If you charge people per letter, they're going to write in a very abbreviated way. That's just how it is. You can tell that I was not raised by people communicating by telegraph. Because I would be much more concise if I had been. Now it's TikTok. TikTok is going to be the end of humanity. Now, I honestly do not know what people are gonna do with TikTok, because I have not figured out how to get on TikTok because I'm that old. Every so often I see these videos, and I can't figure out how to turn the sound on, so I'm not doing very well with TikTok. But the reality is, every generation has found stuff useful that their elders did not find useful. And every generation has thought stuff would be absolutely critical to the youth of coming up after them that they were wrong about. And sometimes we're right. Sometimes we're right about things. Sometimes when people put together a curriculum, they're right about what's going to be useful, particularly if it's very short term. Like if I know that if you want to get a job in this field, you're gonna have to do X, Y, and Z, that's probably pretty good. You know, it's probably pretty reliable, assuming that I know what I'm doing. But you know, it could be done. But if I'm gonna predict what people are going to need 20, 30, 40 years after I'm dead, I don't think I'm going to do a very good job of that. And I'm just basing that on the fact that nobody else ever has, and I don't think my generation is really that special that we've suddenly figured it out. So it's not a stupid question. You know, I do not find this piece of information intrinsically interesting or helpful. Is it going to matter to me in any conceivable way if I don't learn it? And so you can answer that question by saying it's going to be on the final, or you can answer that question by saying, here's why I think that piece of information is going to be useful to you, but it's not actually a stupid question. Or sometimes you will tell somebody something and then they'll turn around and ask you it right back. And you'll think, well, that's a stupid question. It shows they weren't listening. But it doesn't show they weren't listening. It shows they weren't understanding. And maybe they weren't understanding because they weren't listening. And maybe they weren't listening because you were boring. And maybe they weren't listening because their mind was on something else. And maybe they couldn't hear you. Or maybe you just didn't explain it well. But it's not inherently a stupid question. But it took me a very long time to figure this out. I mean, in fairness, I think it takes a lot of us a very long time to figure it out. One of the things that we're working on now is called plain language. There are basically two versions of trying to make your language more accessible to people with less skill with grammar and vocabulary than you have. And there are quite a lot of such people. I grew up in worlds where you could master one dialect of one language and be considered completely fluent communicator. There are neighborhoods where you need to know AABE and formal English, and I don't even know what that one's officially called, and Spanish, and you know, several other languages in order to be a fluent communicator with everybody in the community. I am very good at the grammar and the vocabulary of the one dialect that I know. And somehow in the United States, this has become the mark of being like really good at language. That you only know one, but it's the right one. And we teach kids this language because it is the language of power. It gets them things, gets them access to things. My father was very careful to raise me with an East Coast accent. I did not appreciate that. I was young in Australia, so I had an Australian accent for a while. Moved back to the United States, and if I said footpath instead of sidewalk, if I said mummy instead of mommy, I mean, he would be on me. And I resented the hell out of it. But as I became older, I began to realize that when he had gone east, he worked for the State Department. The East Coast folks treated him as stupid because he had a Texas accent. It was the same thing as all those years later when I'm in my principal's office, hearing that the school will just collapse if anybody finds out I came to the University of Texas. I am not saying the University of Texas is perfect. I think we all know it's not perfect, but I am as proud of it as I would be of any other school I could have gone to. I got a very fine education here. Partly I got a very fine education because I was a weird kid. So they didn't try to mass produce my education. Like nobody cared about the stuff I cared about, or nobody undergraduate cared about it. So they taught me, you know, the way I need to be taught instead of trying to mass produce it. If I had gone to Harvard, there would have been other people who wanted to study analytic philosophy because Harvard was the center of analytic philosophy. And I would not have gotten nearly as good an education at Harvard as I got here. I would have got other things. I mean, I would have got a lot of maroon sweatshirts, which, and I do apologize because I know you're an Aggie, but I'm not that fond of maroon. And I would have missed out on some of the most important things in my life. Some of the things that made me the pieces of who I am that I like. Because, you know, some parts of me I actually think are pretty cool. Well, not go so far as to say all of them, because I've met me, but some of them. So there's plain language, and plain language is a general meaning, which is basically pitch your language to your audience. You know, use language that they know. We don't do this in the disability rights work that I do. It's amazing how hard we try to make policy. And yes, some of it is just because it's easier to say HCBS than it is to type out home and community-based services every single time. It just is. It's easier to say 14C than it is to say sub-minimum wage based on disability. It just is. And so when you're around other people who speak the same jargon, there's really nothing wrong with it. In fact, because the federal government uses this jargon, it's actually quite useful to have mastered it. But then we've got all these people that cannot do policy work. And why can't they do policy work? It's not actually because they can't do policy work. But if you ask most people a question that is pitched to their interests and their knowledge, like could Batman beat Superman, they're going to have an opinion. If you have an opinion as to whether Batman could beat Superman, then you are able to compare two different ways of doing things, two different ways of equipping yourself, and see which would be more effective in a confrontation. And that's policy work. If you can answer the question, well, what would happen if we changed this rule? What would happen if we stopped making students turn in proof that their relatives had died in order to get a day off class? Most students have an opinion on that, which means most students can do policy work. In fact, pretty much everybody I've ever met can do policy work if you make it accessible. But if you go in there and say, so the problem is, you know, it's a Part C SIL, and, you know, so the funding stream is different, and, you know, most people are not going to know, and they're going to feel stupid. Or they're going to feel that, at least if they're not stupid, you're going to treat them as stupid if they start asking questions. They're going to feel like you don't want to include them. They're going to feel like they're not welcome. And these are for reasons. I had a student once when I was teaching, and I had assigned a different textbook. They gave me my own class one semester in grad school, which I promptly then failed out of grad school, whatever. And I assigned a different textbook there in the middle. So my student comes to me and says, you know, I need a tutor for this class. And I said, well, here's the problem. Everybody else on this campus has studied with a different book. So you're probably going to do better if you come to my office hours and I can make extra time for you. And the student said, oh no, I don't want to do that. And I said, you know, your tuition already covers my office hours. It covers time with me. There's a limit to how much time I can devote to you, but I don't see why you would need more time than you are entitled to. And the student said, oh, I don't want you to think I'm stupid. And I thought about that. And I don't think I had done anything to make the students feel stupid because I only just met them. But I'm willing to bet the student had a 12 or 13-year history of being made to feel stupid by teachers. Because they didn't learn, it turned out they had a learning disability. They didn't learn the way everybody else learned. And they didn't show their learning the way everybody else showed their learning. And that was treated as stupidity. And it's a real fear, because if your professor thinks you're stupid, that's going to affect all kinds of things down the road. It's going to affect how you get graded. It's going to affect if you get recommendations. It's going to affect what the gossip in the faculty lounge is about you. This is not it. This is not, I mean, not that self-esteem doesn't matter, but it's not just about self-esteem. It's about power. It's about an ability to navigate through the educational system to get to what you want. And it's a really good question. So we've been looking at how to adapt language for different people. And we take a certain pride at most universities in the material being hard. You know, it's like, I had this one professor, she made more graduate students cry than anybody I've ever met. And I adored her because she happened to teach something that I was naturally good at. So I was doing well in her class. She made me feel smart. So I liked her. Nobody else was that fond of this woman because she made everybody feel stupid. And she was an ideal professor for me because I do really well with a whole lot of detail and precision. I'm the kind of person that has always been able to read a Supreme Court decision. It just makes sense to me. Give me a novel, I'm gonna have trouble with it. Give me a newspaper, I may have trouble with it. But I'm good at the highly precise technical stuff. I'm good at that level of detail. But most people, more people, there's other people like me, but there's more people who struggle with the amount of linguistic complexity and the size of vocabularies that we use. And to a certain extent, we do these things when we don't have to do them. I mean, some ideas are just hard. They're just hard. It's going to take a while to figure them out. But a lot of times we take ideas that don't necessarily have to be that hard, and we say them in a really hard way, or in a way that's hard for some students. All right, it may not be hard for all students, but it's hard for some students. And when we do that, we force these students to function as if they are not as intelligent as the other students. And this has nothing to do with whether they were intelligent to begin with. I've ceased to actually believe that intelligence is even a thing. I've ceased to believe in stupidity. I still feel stupid. I'm very socialized. Spent all morning thinking I'm gonna look stupid in front of these people. You know, I'm very well socialized to that. But when I sit down and think about it, I don't believe it anymore. I've been fortunate enough to be friends with a couple named Norm Kunz, K-U-N-C, and Emma Vanderclift, V-A-N space D-E-R space K-L-I-F-T. And they are a Canadian couple. They work in inclusive education design, and they were heroes of mine when I was much younger. And then by some miracle, I met them, and then by some even weirder miracle, they liked me, and we're now friends. And they've been talking about how in our society we think that ability precedes opportunity. That if you have ability, and in particular cognitive ability, although anybody with a physical disability knows it's not just cognitive ability, but in particular cognitive ability, you get opportunities. We call it meritocracy. You know, talent rises to the top. But in reality, that's not true. It's the other way around. We decide who deserves opportunity. And I'm going to use opportunity in a very broad sense, because it's not just like, I'm not keeping you out of the room. It's also you're supported once you're in the room. You have the tools you need. You have the time to study. You have materials that are in a language that makes sense to you. You have an opportunity to ask questions of somebody who's not going to make you feel stupid. You have all these things. You have these opportunities, and that's where ability comes from. And I'm not saying we're all going to get to the same place, right? There are some people, but no amount of gymnastic opportunity would have made me Simone Biles. None. But almost nobody is hitting their natural limits. They're hitting the limits that are imposed by society. And so we end up with very different kinds of people at a place like Harvard, which is supposed to be the smartest people in the country. Although honestly, I've met some of them. And here, which is supposed to be, you know, not as smart as Harvard, but it's still pretty smart for the state. And then Austin Community, you know, which is supposed to be lower, but it's not actually about negative ability. It's about opportunity. And to some extent, it's about choice, right? I mean, I don't, maybe I could have gone to Harvard, I don't know. But it's possible that I had that opportunity, or would have if I had tried. I don't know. I kind of enjoy not knowing, to be honest, because it freaks people out. They're like, but you could have gone if you wanted to. I'm like, I don't know. They turned me down, that's all I know. So we're working on being more communicatively accessible. And we do this with a lot of things. We have interpreters, we have captioners. Sometimes now we record these things in advance, and then the Q&A is later, which gives people time to process who don't process quickly. Because some people, they just take longer to process things. Sometimes we use simpler language. Sometimes we use more familiar words that are familiar to more people. If you and I are going to talk about policy in the home and community-based service system, I'm going to have to introduce you to the term HCBS, but I can define it for you. If I define it for you clearly enough, then I can include you. If I just say HCBS and you didn't already know what that means, it's not going to help. It's just going to be a big neon sign saying go away. We don't want you here. We're working on Easy Read. Easy Read is simply again for people who really struggle to have access to any written material. It's got visual cues. It's in very simplified language. What I've seen as a recommendation for non-disabled people for plain language is you shoot for about an 8th grade reading level. For disabled people, you shoot for about a 6th grade. But honestly, it should be cued 2 doors in front of you. We have people who are not yet being offered an academic education. 2 of the other people that I know are middle schoolers, a young woman named Kerrigan Rowan in Maine, and a young man named Bobby Lucas in Ohio. They're middle schoolers with Down syndrome. And they have fought to be in the regular classroom and to be treated as equals in the regular classroom. And they spend a lot of their time navigating other people's ableism against them in the schools. And the time they're spending on that, they are not spending learning anything. Bobby, in particular, spent a significant amount of time in segregated classes. He did not like segregated classes. He and his family fought hard getting back in mainstream classes. He's in mainstream classes now, and when he got told he was going to be included for the full day, he said, I'm smart again. And I remember sitting down and thinking about that, because the easy way to take that is, oh, I feel smart. I feel smart. I feel like you've recognized my intelligence. But the reality is, in the segregated classrooms, they were carefully not giving him the grade level vocabulary because they didn't think he was capable of using it. And he was not learning it. Because in general, if you're not exposed to a word, you're never going to learn it. In the mainstream classroom, he encounters these words and he learns them. His test scores have gotten better. His understanding of the material has gotten better. His understanding of the world around him has gotten better. He comments more on news events now, right? He literally is smarter in the regular classroom than he was in the segregated classroom. Bobby himself did not change. And on a larger scale, we've seen this over the course of my lifetime. In 1982, the TV show St. Elsewhere put out an episode about a family. They had, I think, 2 daughters. St. Elsewhere was a medical drama. The family had 2 daughters, they wanted a son. They got pregnant, it was a boy, but then they did testing and found out that the boy was going to have Down syndrome. And what follows is the most appalling bit of bigotry, because we already knew in 1982 that this was not true. They talked about incredibly short lifespans, about never learning to speak, about possibly never learning to walk, and about never learning to recognize your loved ones, about never being able to have a relationship with other people. And there are people that we still think of that way today, although in my experience, again, the issue is that we have not figured out how to support them. But at the time, this was not the prognosis for a baby born with Down syndrome. This was the prognosis for a baby born with Down syndrome at a time when being born with Down syndrome meant you got tossed in an institution and left there for the rest of your life. By 1982, we had the IDEA, so schools had to take children, which meant that you could have all the adults in the household working at least 6 hours a day and still have your disabled kids at home. Because prior to this, schools didn't have to take these kids. And so many of them ended up in institutions because the parents had to choose between putting a roof over their other children's heads or raising this child at home. And again, it started with the richer parents. People began to demand more and more services. And this partly came out of the polio epidemic because people were already attached to their kids by the time they got polio. Whereas they weren't attached to their kids when they found out they had Down syndrome. So the kids with polio were more likely to be fought for and kept at home. So in 1982, we had kids growing up at home and being nurtured in ways that we had not seen, at least since the era of the medicine of the feeble-minded in this country, which is an actual era that we are still contending with today. And we knew that people with Down syndrome could do much more than was described here. And on the show, the family decides to abort the pregnancy because they don't want to deal with somebody with that degree of disability. And there was a great protest. So this is not accurate. You know, people deserve accurate information. When they're making decisions like this, they deserve accurate information so that they can make choices that are in line with their values, their informed choices. And Tom Fontana, who was the guy behind that show, said, yeah, but this is a lot more entertaining. And the thing is, it's not. It's a cliche. It's a cliche we've seen so many times. Today, we know people with Down syndrome who are lobbyists. We know people with Down syndrome who are teachers. We know people with Down syndrome who are models. We know people with Down syndrome who are politicians. We have not figured out how to support every person with Down syndrome to reach this level, right? But we certainly can do it for many. And back when I was born, we didn't know how to do it for anybody. We can talk diagnostic shifts about a lot of disabilities, but Down syndrome is chromosomal. People with Down syndrome haven't changed that much. Bobby Lucas has not changed that much. What has changed has been the supports and the opportunities that he has been given and the chance that people get to function as intelligent, to be seen as intelligent, to be treated as intelligent, to feel intelligent, and to do those things that in our society you allegedly need to have intelligence to have. So obviously my long-term goal is I want to see people with all disabilities showing up on all campuses. I want to see the full diversity of Texans, whoever the hell that is by then, but the full diversity of Texans represented on every university and college campus in the state. Right? I would like to see more melanin in a room like this, but I'd also like to see, I think we're probably statistically about right for wheelchair users. We are not statistically right for people with intellectual disabilities in who meets the typical stereotypes, I don't think. And that's my guess because I don't know wrong. It does not look offhand like we have any blind people in here. Most people seem to look at me, so I'm guessing nobody hears that. Right? I don't know for sure who's watching or who will be watching later, but that's my long-term goal. But for right now, how many students are we making feel stupid, learn less, function as stupid, and miss out on things that they could do and that they have within them that they would like to offer to the world or would like to achieve for their own selves, because that matters too. Because we have certain expectations about what students are like. And they're shot through the educational system. When I first got here, they explained to me how, now this is a long time ago, we had worksheets for figuring out our schedules. And so there's a sheet of paper and it had 5 days across the top and every, I guess, half-hour blocks so that we could have 98-minute classes and 60-minute classes. And the person leading my group said, now the first thing you do is here's the line for when all my children is on. You cross that out. And I thought, well, I am clearly not like everybody else. Everybody else crosses out all my children. Because this was back in the days of VCRs. You weren't going to stream it later. You were either going to have to get it on this ridiculous tape and then tape over it. And then if you waited too long, then you have to figure out where to tape over the next part. It was just easier to watch it live. And there's really no harm in being one of the few students on campus that does not watch all my children. In fact, it was very convenient because it meant that if there's any class that I really needed and I could find it in that time slot, I knew I was going to get in. That those classes were never oversubscribed. The early morning classes were always okay, and all my children classes were always okay. But there are a lot of these expectations that are far more significant. For instance, I have a real trouble with fluorescent lights. I can manage under this much fluorescent light for this long, but this was one of the reasons I didn't make it through graduate school, was because I couldn't be in the classroom that many hours a week. There's really no moral or even, I mean, really, who needs to be able to cope with fluorescent lights? Should I be denied whatever I wanted in life because I can't do fluorescent lights? I'm not saying I'm entitled to everything I want. I'm just saying that's a pretty bad reason to not get it. So I'm just going to toss you out a name because odds are if you were in the room listening to me, you don't know this one. There's a guy named Frank Luntz, F-A-R-A-N-K-L-U-N-T-Z. He is a Republican pollster and strategist, which is why not a lot of people know him. But he has written a book called Words That Work, and it is full of some political ideas that I find interesting. But his thoughts on how to communicate more clearly to a wide variety of people, I find very helpful. And I think this is one place we need to start, because we need to start thinking about what are our students' communication needs. And that includes the students who have disabilities, students with learning disabilities, students who are neurodivergent, the students who are deaf. It also includes the students whose first language is not English, or whose first dialected English is not the English spoken in the classroom. It also includes students whose high schools did not give them a whole lot of really challenging books to read. Because the ability to decipher books is not, again, related to your ability to think. Except insofar as if you can't get the stuff in the books, you're usually going to miss out. And I think this is really what I hope we can talk about in the last few minutes. Well, I'm going to shut up a little bit and let other people talk. Apologies for that. Is how do we do this? How do we start making this place and other places more welcoming to a more diverse group of people in respect to thinking and learning and processing and communication differences? Because right now, we are getting a very narrow stream of people. I mean, there are a few people from outside. I mean, I will know, for instance, Hagen Gurman, who's a deafblind lawyer who graduated from Harvard. She does not fit the Harvard stereotypes. She does not. We have some people who make it, but we all know these folks are exceptions, right? And they're not exceptions because they're not the kind of people who should be there. They're exceptions because they're not the kind of people who are welcomed in. And the more narrow our thinkers are as a community, the more narrow our ideas and our answers are going to be. And the more narrow our ideas and our answers are going to be, the fewer options we're going to have for how we can go in the future. Because there just are ideas that some people have that other people do not have. And the people who do not have those ideas don't even know what they are. People have asked me a number of times, Cal, where do you see the disability rights movement going? I'm like, that's the point. You're asking me because I have the mic. It's the people that don't have the mic that have the answer to that question. That's who you have to ask. You can't ask me, you know, because by definition, I do not know the answer to that question. How do we get a broader range of people in? And how do we democratize this? Because really, we are a species that thinks and learns and contemplates and tries stuff and fails. Because a lot of learning is trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and succeeding. Or at least my learning is. That's what our species is like. And yet somehow we have narrowed down access to this as a role in society to a very small number of people and a very homogeneous number of people. And I don't see the benefit of that. And I don't think most of you see the benefit of that. And if you do see the benefit of that, I will maintain that you're wrong. Because there's just too much cool stuff out there. Just miss chunks of it just because we didn't bother to include people. All right, so I'm gonna shut up now. Finally, everybody take a deep breath of gratitude, and I'd like to know what you all have to say. Yes.
Hi, my name's Kat. Thank you so much for your presentation. My first thought, especially towards the end of what you were talking about, made me wonder, like, do you think we're giving college too much credit as like a place that's worth being at? And I understand, like, I see how it would benefit me as someone who's already here to have like a more diverse and neurodiverse group of people around me, because I think I would learn from them. But I don't know if it's necessary, like, the university as a structure is like baseline good, or a good place to be, or a place where you can learn a lot of useful things even necessarily. So I don't know. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I think it depends on what it is you want to learn and who you learn from. I have learned a very great deal from people that were not at universities. I've learned a great deal about, for instance, lobbying, not from lobbyists, but from people doing customer service work. People doing customer service work, we're doing it well, have a lot of skills for like helping to guide people to want one of the options you want them to want. Right? It's not going to do you any good if you're working at McDonald's and they come in and you say, you want a Whopper, right? Because you're not going to give them a Whopper. You want to guide them to want a Big Mac if you're at McDonald's. And lobbying is very much about convincing our elected leaders that they want to do what we think they ought to want to do. They're not going to do it out of the goodness of their hearts. They're going to do it because they think it's a good idea. And I've learned far more from customer service workers than I have from political theorists. So I think it's both. I think there's a lot of stuff at universities that is very valuable. And I think there are some things that pretty much has to be done at universities. Like, I think if you want to be a great chemist, you kind of got to be at a university these days. Largely because they won't sell you that stuff in the mail anymore. Which I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but there are a lot of other things that we tell people you got to go to university for, and there's really no reason that they would need to. I think university can be great for self-fulfillment. Again, for some people, not everybody finds university a self-fulfilling place. So I think we both need to open up access to the universities, but also I think we need to open up our understanding of who's an expert and what makes for expertise. And we need to be able to cross-pollinate. And again, being able to communicate with people who don't use the same jargon as you really helps. Because if you find a retail worker who knows stuff you need to know, but you cannot manage to not speak in the language of the business school, you're probably not going to learn much. And realistically, it is easier for the people who know the language of the business school to access the language of the street than the other way around. So.
This has been amazing. So thank you for how generous you've been with your time. And I want to ask about the democratizing the process and how that squares with, like, I think about self-advocacy on the one hand, or like gender self-determination for us trans folks, right? I feel like I get caught in these arguments that I didn't set up to begin with, where I'm either a man because I say I'm a man, right? I'm a trans guy, but I never call myself a man actually. So yeah, I'm trans because I say I'm trans, or because I was born that way, right? Or I get locked into these kind of debates that don't meet me where I'm at. So like when we're talking about self-advocacy and democratizing the process, like how do you square the fact that like I am who I say I am because I say I am, without me losing the power of like, oh, well then I'm a caterpillar. Is this making sense? Like, I feel like sometimes our own power gets undermined when we are trying to subscribe to a different system's notion of democracy. So like I'm talking about Habermas, right? So like, I'm gonna democratize the process, just let the best argument win. That's fair, because everybody is rational and everybody will know what the best argument is. But how do we, that's obviously bullshit, just granted what you just said about, we have different people who know different things in different ways and explain them differently. So I just don't know how, like, what is that? I just get frustrated at that point where we're trying to square what we're trying to do with systems that are pretty set on making sure that's impossible or very difficult to do it on their terms.
Well, I think one thing is you don't necessarily have to buy into their terms. And I realize, again, that's really hard thing to say to people who get graded at the end of service semester. But I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember the first George. No, second George W. Bush. He was very good at something called message discipline. And message discipline is answering the question you want to answer, regardless of what question you got asked. So, I mean, he was very good at it. He had backdrops behind him with the message on it. There was no way you could miss what he was trying to get across. Sometimes just not cooperating is very effective. There's a story I'm gonna probably tell Thursday about a group of people that mostly didn't speak. They were in a day rehabilitation center, which is one step below a sheltered workshop. And somebody decided they needed to learn leisure skills. And this step one of leisure skills was sitting quietly on the couch, being peaceful. Well, that doesn't sound that bad until you realize these people are being asked to do this for 4 hours at a stretch. And we had certain people that every day, and I was working in this group, but I wasn't the one who got to decide the program. We had certain people in the group who did wait just so long, and then they'd haul off and hit somebody and get a roll growing. Honestly, it's very boring when you don't talk. Sit on a couch for 4 hours being calm. Every day. And particularly when this is their idea of leisure, right? You don't have to cooperate. And I think to a certain extent, this is where theorizing comes in, because, you know, what are they doing? There are some people who ask the most appalling questions and they mean it well. Right, I'm also trans male. I came into town last night, I got called ma'am 3 times in a row. But you know, it was respectful. And I'm aware that I have large breasts. I'm aware that I'm not surgically altered. I'm aware that I'm not on T. I know what I look like. I know what I sound like. And it actually felt respectful because I'm in Texas where sir and ma'am are respectful terms. Not always, but very often. In Illinois, you're not supposed to say sir and ma'am. It upsets people. But as a face-blind person, I've also really struggled to cope with the explosion of trans visibility, because it's a lot easier if I can't tell who somebody is, but I can pretty much guess what gender they're presenting as. And I can go with sir and ma'am, I can cover it up. People don't really know. If everybody has different pronouns, then I have got to learn who they are. Because if I don't know who they are, I'm not going to know what pronoun they're using. But I think it's a struggle, and I think to some extent we need to be more forgiving of people who just don't get it. Because some people don't. They've had completely different experiences than us. And in some extent, I think we need to be less forgiving of people who just don't get it, because they're not getting it on purpose. And we need to get better at telling the difference. Because there are people who will ask the most ignorant questions because they are legitimately, honestly ignorant, have not had the opportunity to learn something and would like to learn. And there are people who ask the most ignorant questions because they are trying to provoke you. And I think it's a struggle. I think moving forward as an immense diverse group of people is a struggle. But I think it's a worthwhile struggle. I think it's a lot easier when you only have to worry about a small group of people. Like if you're only worrying about the European nobility, that's a pretty, you know, coherent group. It's a lot less, I mean, sure, they used to start wars and stuff, right? But they all had some shared understandings. We have far fewer shared understandings now with a far more diverse group of people that we're paying attention to. And of course, Europe was always pretty diverse, and the whole world was always diverse. But it wasn't all just the royalty, but the royalty is who we listen to. The only people we listen to are Gwyneth Paltrow and people who are like Gwyneth Paltrow. It's going to be easier. It's going to be less contentious. But I think it's also we're going to miss out on a very great deal. Particularly this Gwyneth Paltrow. Let's go on.
We do have a question that's coming from the Q&A also, and Jazz is going to read it out.
Hello. Can y'all hear and see me?
Yes.
For those that applies to. So this question is from Lindsay. And Lindsay asks, what are some resources you'd recommend to help us detrain the way we think about intelligence, to deprogram the ableism that society gave us, like books, podcasts, videos, writers, or people to follow on social media? Thank you.
Well, I think to a significant extent, we need to be looking at the people who are doing the work, which is the people with intellectual disabilities who meet the stereotypes of intellectual disability, right? Because like with all groups, you get a few people who get in, but there are people who don't meet the stereotypes. You know, and then everybody's like, well, they're the exceptions. Liz Weintraub over at AUCD is very worth listening to. Roland's work is very worth listening to. People First of Canada does amazing work. They've written my favorite ever press release. And I know it's weird to even have a favorite ever press release, but it was a really good press release. Somebody said there was no such thing as ableism in Canadian society, and they're like, let us just explain this to you now. Many of these groups have people first in their names. Others have self-advocacy in their names. And you've got to be careful because, again, the neurodiversity movement, which is, it's not solely college educated people, but it's a far higher proportion of college educated people than the classic self-advocacy group, has also adopted the term self-advocacy. I pretty much came up through independent living and then neurodiversity. So I'm not who you want to be talking to about this. There's old stuff by people like Hank Bersani did a collection. Self-advocates in leadership, which is a Washington State group, they are starting to push for no means testing for public benefits, no gatekeeping. I said the gatekeeping itself is harmful, and I think it's a very good analysis, and it's not one I've seen made elsewhere. But I think also you just gotta get to know people. And when you are tempted to think this person is just making no sense, I don't understand them, stop and try again to understand them. Just start with the assumption, the presumption of competence, that they have a perspective, they have thoughts about that perspective. Their perspective comes from somewhere. It doesn't mean it's right, but it comes from somewhere. And you should understand it before you discard it. There are people that I definitely think are wrong, but they mostly have reasons, and their reasons are rooted in different experiences than mine. My father, for instance, had very different politics than mine on the surface. We have very similar values. My mother and I had very similar politics on the surface. Our values were very different. And one of the things that I learned from my dad growing up was that if you push down, you don't look at the surface disagreement, but you keep pushing down, you can very often find where you do have areas of agreement. Currently, our society is incredibly politically divided. But except for, a few people, on Joseph Mercola, for instance, whatever, that I think are trying to benefit themselves at the cost of other people, most of the people with whom I have the deepest disagreements, they're still people. They're still people, and they're probably about as scared and as confused and as overwhelmed as I am. And that's something in common. And that doesn't mean I have to agree with, if they are being racists, or if they are being ableists, or if they are, suggesting that certain people deserve to be killed, or I don't have to agree with that. But I can recognize that there's a deep level of humanity down there where they're scared and they're overwhelmed. And they have reasons for what they think, even if I do not accept those reasons. And I can recognize their humanity and their personhood, even if I don't give 1 inch on some of their beliefs. Because some of the beliefs I just will not yield on. But also, if I understand them and I talk to them respectfully, I'm a lot more likely to make a difference. So and no, I don't always want to do that. But if I'm going to engage with somebody, I might as well try to do it in a manner that has a chance of changing either their mind or the mind of somebody watching. I don't know if that helps at all, Lindsay, but I think just get to know different people. Get to know the weirdest people you can. The people that you are automatically socialized to go look towards, we're all socialized to look towards the same people. If you see somebody on the street that's homeless, stop and say, hey, would you like me to buy us some pizza? Like, you can have a conversation, you can get to know somebody, you can get to know a little bit about somebody in an elevator ride. And you don't have to do this, but some of the most valuable things I've ever learned have been from just going up to people and interacting. Spend a lot of time in emergency rooms right now, not for fun reasons. Well, not that there really are fun reasons to hang out there, but just going up to people and saying, I heard you say on the phone that your phone's almost dead. I have a charger and a cord. Will this help? You can meet people and you can learn a little bit about life, and you probably learn a little bit about somebody who's different than you. And particularly if you don't specifically look for the people that are dressed like you and have their haircut like you. That's just what I found. It's just go in the opposite direction from where society tells you to go, because that's where the interesting people are. And more than that, there's interesting people in centers of power. There's some cool people in centers of power, but they don't have much time. People who have time to teach you are on the margins. So you're much better off going there. Does that help?
Yes, Lindsay.
How would I know?
Lindsay says in the chat, thank you, and especially liked the portion where you said presumption of competence doesn't mean they're right, but it comes from somewhere, and you should understand it before you discard it. They have different reasons rooted in different experiences than mine. So that, yes, Lindsay was very satisfied with your answer. And I was wondering if I could ask a question. I'm wondering if you have any insight on how to build relationships with people who are incarcerated in institutions, especially if you are someone who has lived experience with institutions and may have difficulty in those spaces.
That is hard. One possibility is to get a different role, a role that protects you. One possibility is to go to places like Best Buddies, and I don't like Best Buddies, but they serve a purpose. This is an organization where they match you with somebody who usually has an intellectual disability, and you go out and you do stuff together. And for many people, this is the only chance that they get to go out into the community, just without tons of staff and everybody around them. So these things serve a purpose. It can be very hard to get into some of the dicier institutions, but there are all kinds of institutions out there. You can become a CASA volunteer, because a lot of those kids are institutionalized. You could, and increasingly some people are getting access to technology. So we're getting video feeds in now. That's one thing the pandemic did help us with. So it's more possible, but yes, it is really hard because segregation is a natural consequence of this. And segregation is hard to cross. So, I'm sorry, that's a very inadequate answer.
I think it's a very understandable answer given the circumstances. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm just going to let people know that we are at 6 o'clock now. And we want to be mindful of people's time. But Cal, are you interested in hanging out afterwards if there's any other questions?
Sure.
Okay. So I am going to just let folks know that we're going to end the cast here. And you can put some questions in, and Jazz might stay on with us for a little bit if they would like to, and we can continue on. And I want to thank Cal as an elder and an advocate for being here with us to talk about all of these things that said it was beautiful and lovely, and thank you for making it here, and I look forward to your other topics in the next couple of days.
Thank you so much, all of you, for putting up with my bullshit for 2 hours. Even my dog won't do that anymore.
And I want to give a really big thank you as well to our interpreters and captioners. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.